Merilyn, and we will go ahead and get started. So thank you all so much for joining, and thank you, Merilyn, for doing this for us.
Thank you, Kelly, and I'm glad to be with everyone. Good morning to all out there. Hopefully we can hold your attention with this, and I can do all things correctly. And at the end, I'm looking forward to your questions. I'm going to move fairly quickly because I have some scenarios I'd like for us to do based upon the earlier part of our training. So I hope you got your listening ears on and you can feel free to take notes. Okay, and I too am going to remind everyone so that everyone can hear, please, please, please mute your phone. Okay, thank you so much. All right, we're going to talk about an area that brings in a lot of questions in our minds, and this is this area of equal access to housing. The term equal access, as used in today's training, will be used in a very broad definition. When we say equal access, what we mean is different groups of people must have identical rights, or they are given identical treatment. They have the same opportunities as others, no matter how different people are, to access housing. In other words, they have the same ability, the same status or rights as all other people to housing. So if we say, let's use some regular terminology this morning and just say everyone is on equal footing, okay? And that would put us in the ballpark where I'd like for us to begin. Okay. Let's see how well I can do all of this. Our starting point this morning is going to be understanding fair housing. And I know a lot of you guys say, I got that already, Merilyn. I don't need that, but I need to remind you that all who view our training may not have the access that you will have or your expertise. And so we want to be able to pick up everybody. So our key one this morning is who's covered by the fair housing laws. Real quickly, the Federal Fair Housing Act prohibits discrimination under the Big Seven, which is race, color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, and familial status. But I want to remind you, approximately 20 states, plus the District of Columbia, and more than 150 cities, towns, and counties across the United States have additional protections that specifically prohibit forms of discrimination. Just by way of reminder, states and municipalities added their own, and you'll hear such things as age, ancestry, marital status, military discharge status, lawful source of income, in other words, what we would call government assistance or child support, order of protection. So there are some cities and ordinances which prohibit discrimination if a person is a victim of domestic abuse, sexual orientation, housing status, gender identification. I've actually found some ordinances that say you cannot discriminate on a person's occupation, their sexual preference, whether or not they have HIV, political affiliation. I actually found that one. Nor can you discriminate on the business of any individual, their place of residence, their genetic information. There are so many areas. So whatever you can come up with, believe me, it's out there. And so it's not just enough to know what the federal law says. You also want to look and make sure you're operating in compliance with your local laws. So our second key we're going to deal with this morning quickly is what housing is covered by the federal laws. Again, it's information you know and you understand. So fair housing laws cover almost all housing, including seasonal, single-family condos, assisted living facilities, manufactured homes, dorms, group homes, mobile homes, homeless shelters, rooming houses, duplexes, multi-unit dwelling shelters for victims of domestic violence, nursing homes, vacant land which is intended for future housing. But one of the things, dwellings where a person intends to return. So like, let's say a hotel or motel. Remember, the term dwelling is broadly defined, and I found where some courts have ruled a houseboat is a dwelling, a recreational vehicle. Barracks are considered dwellings, an orphanage. How about a B&B? I actually found a case where a barn is considered a dwelling. So when you start talking about what does the law cover, pretty much anything that a person, again, intends on returning is considered a dwelling. Now, I know some of you are saying, like, Merilyn, all of this is turning me upside down. It gets so confusing. Well, I know it feels like I'm bouncing you around, but I promise by the time we're done with all of this, you're going to say, I got it. All right. When we talk about housing, we're talking about both public and private, but there are some exceptions. So housing that is, look at that word, legitimately designed for persons, for older persons, are excluded. So you can have a gated community where everything in that gated community is single-family housing, and that entire gated community can be designated as housing for older persons. And one of the safe ways to do this is just look to the federal laws and stick with what HUD has designed to identify immediately housing for older persons. Sometimes the laws feel like it's a little confusing, but I sincerely believe we've got this down to a science right now, in the sense of you are exempt if you're a religious organization or a private club, and you restrict membership to only your members. Although, you guys, I just read a case where a United Methodist Church had a gated community, and they wanted to say members only could reside there. The problem is, for the last 30 years, they haven't stuck to their own rules, and so they were being challenged in court, and I just saw a settlement on that where they're going to get in compliance with membership only. All your membership can be restricted, but the one thing you cannot discriminate on is the basis of race. So let's take a quick look at this. Again, we've got some circumstances where you're exempt if you are Mrs. Murphy. Everybody remembers that. 2, the owner has single-family housing being sold, and you're not using a broker or a realtor. 3, owner does not own more than 3 units at one time and only has one sale in 2 years. And I say exempt maybe or maybe not. It depends on the circumstances. Also, I want to point out the Civil Rights Act of 1866, it prohibits all discrimination based on race in the sale of real or personal property. So it doesn't fall under the Fair Housing Act, it still may fall under a federal law. Our third key we quickly want to take a look at, I'm not going to go through all of these because you know them so well, is which housing providers are subject to fair housing law. And again, every time I think there's nothing new under the sun, the Department of Justice just settled a case involving mortgages, and you might want to go up and pull up DOJ's cases and take a look at that settlement, because they use an age-old argument that the Fair Housing Act cannot be used to regulate what it is that they were doing. And again, the courts rule against them. And so every time I think we got this, everybody knows it, I'm finding that is not always the case. I want to remind you, housing provider can include people in the business of renting, who are managing, who are selling, who are doing finances, or simply providing other housing-related services. Okay? I know, don't let it throw you. Our third key, I love this one, is which housing, and I got a big old fat X through there, are subject to housing laws. I want to remind you not to forget. All staff, employees, agents, volunteers, or residents are subject to the Fair Housing Act, even though they do not provide housing. Fair housing laws fall not only to housing providers, but they also cover people who provide no housing. The law says no one has the right to interfere with the quiet enjoyment of the housing of another. So this covers your maintenance staff, your invited third-party agents. Let's say you've got somebody coming in and they're doing some construction work or renovations on your property. They have to be in compliance with the laws, the fair housing laws. I've got one. How about a volunteer family member who shows property when the owner goes out to lunch and they put a family member in there to show units? And they felt, for example, that this person really is not in the business of providing housing. They're just there to help them out during lunchtime. But guess what? The law says they're covered. How about summer interns? They're also covered under the Act. As a matter of fact, any neighbors or guests of residents are also covered under the Fair Housing Act. It is illegal to harass or intimidate those protected under the Act. How about somebody that's on your property doing cat calls, or someone who constantly calls the police because they know if this person has enough complaints against them, they're going to be forced out. Persons making derogatory remarks, persons booing, slurs, taunts, hissing, making inappropriate gestures, persons who are bullying, teasing, mocking, jeering, or causing vandalism. Oftentimes we go against the person that they're targeting and not go after the person who's doing the action. That is clearly an 808 violation, and they're in violation of the Fair Housing Act. So if we go back real quick by way of reminder, our fifth key is it tells us what is prohibited. I'm not going to go through those for you because you could probably recite them in your sleep, but I do want them there. We also continue dealing with those who are in the lending business, and we dealt with those first persons who I was just talking about, who threaten, coerce, or intimidate others. And then my favorite is advertising. Every time I think we're not going to have any advertising issues again, I'm always surprised. Don't go on Google or some of those pages, search engines. You might be shocked of what language you'd find. HUD's mission is to create strong, sustainable, inclusive communities and quality, affordable homes for all persons. Now, that's our mission, and so in order to ensure that Americans have access to housing, we're reminded of this executive order, which says that the administration of all federal programs and activities relating to housing and urban development in a manner that affirmatively to further fair housing throughout the entire United States. So how do we accomplish this? What must be done in order to open up housing opportunities for more persons? Because that really is all of our goals. That's what we want to accomplish. That's what we want to succeed at. So let's take a moment, step back for a second, and let's examine this thing called equal access to housing. Our sixth key is going to deal with what in the world does this term equal access mean? And ladies and gentlemen, if you'll take a quick look, it really does cover broadly race, color, national origin, which often involves language, disabilities, both mental and physical. How about this one? Equal access also would include ex-offenders or persons who have been arrested, gender identity, sexual orientation, marital status, victims of domestic violence. These are all would be covered under this term called equal access. So, sorry about that. I'm a little late and I'm a little excited. And if anybody has ever sat in my trainings, you know I'm probably jumping up and down about now. So please forgive me for being a little late with my slide presentation. HUD published a final rule to ensure that all individuals have equal access to many of the department's core shelter programs. HUD published a final rule that requires housing facilities and services funded through programs administered by CPDG to establish, amend, or maintain program admission standards, operating policies, and procedures in a manner to ensure equal access to programs, benefits, services, and accommodations. So, the equal access rule is designed to set HUD-assisted or HUD-insured properties and programs will be available to individuals and families regardless of their sexual orientation, their gender identity, or marital status. And this equal access rule also applies to Native Americans and Hawaiian programs. So if I had to really quickly call off some things. Let's say, for example, you're receiving CDBG money or home money, continuing care money, the Homeless Emergency Assistance Fund, HOPWA, which is Housing Opportunities for Persons with AIDS, the Housing Trust Fund, you're receiving some monies under that, or rural housing. Any of those programs are going to fall under this rule called equal access. So let's step back for a moment and take a breath. Providers that operate single-sex projects using funds awarded through HUD's Office of Community Planning and Development are required to provide all individuals with access to programs, to their benefits, services, accommodations in accordance with that person's gender identity without subjecting that person or persons to intrusive questioning or being asked to provide documentation to prove gender identity. Now, I've said a lot, so I want you to know what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure to the presentation that you'll be able to access through the Indiana office some sites that you can go to and pull up some information to help you examine what you already have in place. Is it sufficient? Is it enough? Is there something else that we could be doing that will make sure that you're operating within these guidelines? I don't want any surprises. I don't want you to feel like we're out there saying, I gotcha, because that's not the idea. But this area continues to change. And one of the things, for example, persons that are changing their gender identity, for example, they're running into problems with IDs. So trying to get your birth certificate changed, trying to get your driver's license different. But there are agencies out there who can help these individuals get the proper ID. And all you want to be able to do is say, you know, you may want to go to this site to seek some help and get additional information. So, HUD rules requires a recipient, a sub-recipient, which many of you are, or a provider to establish, amend, maintain program admissions, occupancy, and operating policies and procedures, to protect individuals' privacy and their security so that equal access is provided to individuals based on their gender identity. Note, this requirement includes tenant selection and your admissions preferences. So we're going to deal with this a little bit more because what I want you to do is make sure you have a good basis that when you get off this training, you're going to say, I got it. I know what it is I'm supposed to be doing, and I just need some help in getting it done. And that's what we're going to do today. The rule prohibits sexual orientation, gender identity in all these programs, including Hawaiian programs and Native American. And the final rule adopted the proposed rules, and there were some minor changes clarifying loans and so forth, but if you're not making a loan, don't worry about it. The final rule, I have provided the regulations, so if you want to pull that up at your convenience, it's going to be in your presentation. All right, so let's do some things here. I need you to put your thinking cap on. I don't want you to be worried about anything because I would never lead you astray. And let's do some training scenarios based upon what I've said today. And I'm hoping Kelly can open up the lines because I really would like to be able to interact with our audience and that they can respond to me and the questions. Our first scenario. Everybody hearing music like I am?
Yep.
Okay, maybe we can't pull this off. I don't know if you can still hear me above the music.
Yes.
Okay. Scenario one says you are a continuing care organization and your board member and some of your stakeholders are faith-based housing providers that require proof of marriage prior to enrolling a household with male and female adults in emergency shelter and or transitional housing programs. What do you do? Can I get a response from anybody today? You receive funds through continuing care. What can you do when an organization requires, or some of your faith-based membership requires proof of marriage? Don't everybody answer at once.
Hi, this is Donna in Evansville, and I would say that asking for a marriage certificate, but when you have situations where marriage isn't legal in your state with the same sex, I don't know what you would do. Ask to see a ring?
That's a good answer. Someone else?
We've got a comment in the chat box saying that you cannot discriminate based on familial status.
Okay, but marriage is not familial status. Okay, let me help you a minute. Okay, a permanent supportive housing program that serves families. You must serve all types of families. Under HUD rules, you cannot tell one family that we'll only allow you if you can show what your marital status is. You cannot base it on actual or perceived sexual orientation. So, for example, two adults show up and they want to be roommates. You cannot say, or your partner organization cannot come out and say, we demand in order to stay here, they've got to produce a marital certificate. If they present themselves together as a family, you as the recipient or sub-recipient, HUD rules require you to serve the two adults as a family and not demand proof of marriage, and you cannot limit assistance to couples that are only in a heterosexual relationship if you are serving families, okay? And just so you'll know, this policy applies to any recipient that is doing continuing care or emergency shelter money. And it does apply to all faith-based groups, okay? So what you want to do is back up a little and understand what the law is really trying to get at. Persons that we're trying to serve may not have access to, quote unquote, the things that we feel are necessary to show that you have a marriage certificate. Okay? So they're not trying to add a burden to persons who would not have access to your housing, be it in an emergency shelter or otherwise, simply because of something that is perceived or actual that one of your board members may have problems with. Any questions or concerns?
We've got another question in the chat box. What if two individuals are related, like sisters, brothers, etc.? Would this still qualify?
It would still qualify as family. When you serve family, and it could be families with children, you must serve all families with children. So that includes families of any composition type. So if you got a single dad and he comes in with his children, or a single mom, same-sex couple, multi-generational, and non-romantic persons who present themselves services as a family, we have to service them if we're receiving those federal monies. Just treat them as a family. Any other questions? All right, let's try scenario number 2. You're a housing manager in a small complex that receives some HUD funding, and you overhear your two maintenance men having discussions that is summed up in the following statements. Any person who can't speak or read English should not be living here. They're taking up units that good Americans could be living in. What do you do?
Educate those maintenance workers on the law.
Agreed. One of the things we have to be concerned about in these kinds of situations is these folks would fall under Title VI, and Title VI requires to plan for and provide meaningful access to services. And one of the things is in our language, the Fair Housing Act prohibits housing providers, both public and private, from refusing to rent to non-English speaking simply because they do not speak English. So many housing providers do not have policies in place that facilitate meaningful language access. And in this day and time, I would encourage that you do some other things, even if let's say a person who walks in and they only speak Vietnamese. You need to know how to access an interpreter for someone, and that may be the only person who has come to your facility who needs that assistance or needs that accommodation. You have to know how to access these various services. So you need a plan in place. And it has to be a written plan, not just a plan in just the manager's head. You need to put it in writing so everyone will know, who do we call? Who do we reach out to for interpretation? And housing providers have to have this access plan in place. And if you don't, then you're not able to demonstrate you're in compliance with the fair housing laws. What is being done now is, if you don't have something in place, then it demonstrates that you are not in compliance with the Fair Housing Act or with Title VI. Okay? Questions? Comments? All hex? Let's try scenario 3. Okay, this is one of my favorites. You're hired to supervise several housing programs that the board believes to be getting out of control. Previous managers were either fired or demoted, and your tough, no-nonsense approach was highly sought after to get programs under control. One day, as you're reading over the program's standard policies and procedures, you see that there is a blanket policy of refusing to rent to anyone with a criminal record. What do you do? Don't everybody speak at once.
You take their application under consideration just like anybody else's.
Hear, hear. I just want to give you a few statistics, if you don't mind. That is a correct answer. According to the Department of Justice, as many as 100 million U.S. adults, or nearly 1/3 of our population, has a criminal record of some sort. The United States prison population of 2.2 million adults is by far the largest in the world. Since 2004, an average of over 650,000 individuals have been released annually from our federal and state prisons, and over 95% of our current inmates will be released at some time soon. And when individuals are released from prisons and jails, their ability to access safe, secure, and affordable housing is critical to their ability not to go back into the system. Across the United States, African Americans and Hispanics are arrested, convicted, and incarcerated at rates that are disproportionate to their share of the general population. Consequently, criminal records base barriers to housing, so that's that blanket policy that I threw in there. So when you have a policy like that, a criminal record is, even though it's not a protected characteristic, it disproportionately impacts on minority home seekers. So if you do a blanket approach without any justification, more than likely or not, you're going to be in violation of the Fair Housing Act. You got to be able to have a basis to point to say, we flat out are not going to rent to persons who have been registered as pedophiles. Okay, that makes sense. And the Fair Housing Act allows for that. Or persons who manufacture certain types of drugs. Okay, but you got to have a plan, and it has to be a written plan that's in place. One of the things, I just went through a training myself in which they were looking at some states and some local municipalities, some smaller villages and so forth, and they found on their books, for example, if you've ever been arrested. Well, okay, it's been a long time since I've been out of high school, and maybe I got arrested, was not found guilty of anything, but you go back far enough, you may have found my arrest record. So we had people just denying folks housing just based upon an arrest record. Not a conviction, just an arrest. So I want you to think in this capacity. We've got convicted folks who have served their time. Whoa. We've got folks out there who have been convicted but never were incarcerated, time served or whatever. And then we've got people who were arrested but they never had a conviction. If we do these approaches where if you had an arrest record or if you've ever been convicted, that's 3 categories of people we're literally are making homeless based upon our policy. So what you want to do is make sure you've got a policy in place that you can point to say, we're looking at each case individually, and if a person, let's say, when they were 21 years old, they were arrested, incarcerated for 4 years, they're now 39 years old or 49 years old, they've never been in any other trouble, there's no reason that you cannot say that person is not someone that you could rent to. Questions, comments, or concerns? All right, let's go to scenario number 4. And I'm presuming what you guys are doing is you're typing up your questions really quick so at the end, Kelly can read them all back and we can get some correct answers for you. Okay? All right, scenario number 4. You are a staff member. You're on duty at a 5-bed transitional living program for young adults, ages 18 to 24. Alex is age 18 and questioning gender identity and has chosen to use the pronouns they, them, their to indicate that he or she is not being aligned with either end of the gender spectrum. So Alex is not calling himself a him or a her, okay? Housemates have been giving Alex a hard time. You have your office door open. You hear the following conversation. Alex, why were you in the girls' bathroom? You dress and act like a guy. None of us want you around. You step out of your office and you notice that the atmosphere is tense and becoming aggressive. What do you do? Chickens. All right, guys. First of all, you cannot not do anything. And I would suggest, because the language in here is that the atmosphere is tense and becoming aggressive, all staff should be made aware of when it's time to call 911. Everybody, be it a resident or client or be it a staff person, if there is the possibility of harm, just inform whoever's concerned, call 911. Let the police take charge and do their job. But if it's a situation in which you can get everybody separated. One of the things you want to have in place is the ability to investigate whether or not it's informal or formal complaint. You want to be able to deal with this kind of conduct very quickly. So what I'm going to suggest that you do is you need to have in place something that can deal with conflict resolution, okay? And that means getting your staff trained so that they'll at least be able to act in accordance with standard policies and procedures. Because what you don't want to do is scream and holler at one person, because then they're going to very possibly retaliate against someone else. So what you want to be able to do is know how to bring everybody under calm, and everyone that comes to your facility to live should know what your policies and procedures are for any harassing conduct or behavior. To me, this situation sounds like a hostile environment. That's where I would put this, because it's becoming tense and aggressive, and one person is being singled out as being different. So therefore, what we want to do is be able to deal with this alleged or growing hostile environment by quashing the conduct very quickly. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be real honest with you. I think you best cover yourselves, your staff, and your facility if it's in writing, and anyone who comes there to leave receives a very clear copy of what your policies and procedures are for conduct that that seems like it's harassing to anyone. Anything from giving them a notice that, you know, they're not going to be housed here if they don't correct it, to immediately removing them from the housing situation, depending on what's going on. So Alex has a right to feel safe. One of the things I would suggest you might want to do is maybe offering Alex a facility that's closer to management's work area or office area. Everything from talking to Alex to ask, do you feel like you're in harm's way? What can you suggest that we can do to better this situation? Would you feel comfortable, Alex, in talking to the person and telling them to back off and leave you alone? I mean, these are all conversations that you need to have with your staff and with your residents. Another thing that you can do is everybody needs to understand that no one group has precedence over another group. So, for example, if I'm doing an emergency shelter, I need everyone to understand that we provide housing to all persons. Okay, not based upon what your beliefs are or your perceived prejudices are. We're going to provide housing to all persons. And I hate to say this, in this day and time, we really need to go back to having discussions on civility. I know as a lawyer, as you know, a lawyer has to be licensed by their state board. And I'm going to tell you something. They're making us take tons of classes now on civility. And I thought, oh, my goodness. And at first I thought it was a joke, because that stuff costs a lot of money. But no, they're holding us up and saying we need to get back to a standard of where we simply respect one another. We don't have to agree, but we must respect one another. So any comments? Any concerns? All right, let's go to scenario number 5. in a small rural shelter that houses 20 men and 8 women in separate rooms of 4 to a room. Staff person walks onto the porch of the shelter used by clients to smoke and hears client A saying, "You know she shouldn't even be allowed to stay in my room. She's not even a girl." Client B asks, "What are you talking about?" Client A, "It's not fair. She's a guy and it makes me uncomfortable. She shouldn't be allowed to stay in my room. I'm worried she's watching me get undressed. And when I get ready for bed, it reminds me of another situation in my past. I have a really..." Client B, "Are you sure? How do you know? You're the staff person. What do you do?" Boy, you guys are not helping me out here. Just to give you a little hint.
We had a comment. We had a comment in the chat box that just says, "Intervene and educate."
That's a good one. That's a good one. Okay. One of the things I'm hoping that you spotted, and this is an ongoing argument that we probably hear most from persons who are attempting to provide safe shelter for victims of domestic violence. They have problems with trying to work out what we call gender integrated housing. So let's back off for a little bit. It sounds like client A may have been a victim of some form of domestic violence, because client A says, "This reminds me of another situation in my past. I really have a hard time falling asleep." Okay? What we want to do is we want to get training in place so that client A has the ability to come to the staff and say, "I'm not comfortable in this situation. I want to be moved." You cannot remove the person that client A is fearful of simply because client A is not comfortable or frightened or fearful. And I'm going to tell you something. The fear is legit. I never minimize the fear that client A may be receiving. But client A needs to understand, you know, what the situation is and what the laws say we must do. So we're going to really sit down and talk about this so client A will know I'm not just simply brushing her concerns off. I am never going to acknowledge whether or not the person they're speaking of is transgender. Okay, we're never going to talk about yay, nay, nixie. We're not going to talk about that. What we're going to do is deal only with client A's concern. Okay, so we're going to see if we can get client A moved to a different room, or to switch out with someone, or to a different facility. Okay, yes, ma'am, we understand. We take this serious. Okay, but we have to provide housing to persons that you may not like or you may not feel like. And let's switch this for just a second. What if the person, client A, is saying, "I don't want to live in the room with Hispanic people. They ain't a real American. I don't want to live with them." Or like we had here in Chicago, where the gentleman jumped on a lady because she was wearing a Puerto Rican shirt and saying she's not a true American. Sometimes things are just ignorant, okay? So what we want to do is we have to educate our client base as well as our staff. Any questions? All right, let's try scenario 6. You're an emergency shelter project that houses 15 families in a large renovated home, shared kitchen and bathroom facility. Project staff support families to move into more permanent arrangements throughout their 90-day stay. Each shift has a manager on site throughout the shift. One evening, the father of Ben comes in to speak with you regarding his family's case manager. So this is somebody on your staff. The father states that, talking about the case manager, she's been giving Ben, his 13-year-old son, a hard time. The father tells you, well, you know how we told you Ben was born Megan, and later we found out he identified as a boy. I want to stop right there for a second because you know I'm going to ask you, what do we do? Okay? Real quickly. Understanding gender transition is important. Transition refers to the time period that many transgender people go through to live as the gender that they best identify with, instead of their gender that they were born with at birth. A significant part of transitioning is the social aspect, going to a new home by a new name, using pronouns, changing one's outer appearance, their clothing, their hairstyle, so that other people see that person as the gender that the person identifies with. For some, this process includes medical treatments like hormones or surgery. Staff use the same name and pronoun preferred by the client even when the client is not around. So if a client comes in and identifies themselves as a she, but to you they appear to be a he, our staff is required to deal with the person as they see themselves. So even when the person is not around, we as staff have to refer to the person as a she. Okay? So staff must always refer to residents by the name and pronouns that match their gender identity unless the person has requested otherwise. As a general standard, staff should avoid asking personal questions unrelated to the provisions of housing or as shelter. The agency should have a policy in writing of non-discrimination and ensures that all staff knows it and is following that policy as stated in its entirety. Okay? I want to add now to the rest of what we know is the rest of the title, scenario 6. Okay? And you can read it in somebody's background.
Can everyone, just a reminder, go ahead and mute your lines, please. It looks like we've got someone on the phone.
Yeah. All right. It has created a lot of problems in the old school. This is still the dad talking. As part of the reasons why we moved here without a job or anything. So I feel like I should tell the staff, in this case, there was a problem, but I don't expect the staff itself to be the problem. You're now the person on staff that they're talking to, so you ask, what's going on? The father says, well, the caseworker keeps implying that Ben might be happier doing things, girl things. At first, my wife and I didn't notice. We thought it was just encouraging Ben to play with other kids. But then we realized she was actually encouraging Ben to play with girls and only spoke up to encourage him to do activities when there was a group of girls playing. It's not like she's blatantly challenging how we're raising Ben, but we're worried of where all this is headed. It was hard enough getting through the first time My family doesn't need someone putting Ben through the ringer again. He's just getting settled at school and making friends. I really don't want any problems. You're the night manager, so my question was, what do you do? Okay? One of the things is, remember I told you about the rules in which staff has to be changed, all right? The rules HUD does not require project participants to select whether or not they're male or female. In fact, HIM's data element, which is 3.6, gender, allows multiple gender categories, including transgender, and doesn't identify as male, female, or transgender. So, ladies and gentlemen, what we want to do is we want to encourage our staff that we're going to respect the parents of Ben and allow them to decide what is best for Ben. So we're going to keep our personal comments to ourselves. So the staff person, and I was reading a case the other day, it was a nurse who was doing some of these comments, and everybody thought a nurse would have had more expertise in this area, but it turns out the nurse had her own idea as to what was best for Ben. If Ben was born Megan, then he should be doing more Megan kinds of things. But that's not up to us to decide as persons who are employed in housing. Our job is simply to work with the families that we serve. So I know I've thrown a lot at you in this hour, but I want to be able to interact with you and find out what is it that you would like to ask with regards to access to housing. I think one of the fastest growing populations right now that is difficult in finding housing is persons with arrest records. But one of the largest populations not being served are teens who are transgender. So there's a lot of runaways and no place to go. And what we're not doing is we're not providing access to housing to those persons. So I thought this was such an on-time training. So how can I help you?
We just got a comment in the chat box. It says, I understand the identity aspect of this and using terms acceptable to Ben, but from a documentation standpoint, how do we document it? If you have ID, socials, saying something different, how do you reconcile the two?
Okay, that's a good question. One of the things I'm going to suggest that you do is there are some national groups who can help you be more specific on your plans. I don't want to say this is what HUD requires, because what we're saying is every housing provider is trying to service different groups. So we didn't come out with one blanket statement to say in every situation this is what you do. But what we have been doing is partnering with persons that serve the LGBTQ community to find out what can we do and to provide services to our clients. That's why I'm going to do an attachment at the end of this presentation for you to get, so that they're on a national level, and there are some great tips out there on how to best deal with these various aspects. So, for example, if a person, if I was a housing provider I just got my training today. We have no policies in place, and the person who comes in, their ID appears to identify them with an opposite sex that they're identifying themselves with. And what I would do is a couple of things. I'd ask the person, what is it that you're seeking? So, for example, we house only women here who are seeking safety from a domestic situation. But while I'm servicing this person, I would at least pick up a phone and call either in my community or one of the national organizations to say, this is my scenario, this is what I'm dealing with, how do I best deal with servicing this person? So I'm of the opinion, even as a lawyer, I don't have all information in my head, but I sure know where to get help from so that I can give out the correct information.
Thank you. And then we had another question pop up. Earlier you made the statement about discrimination, including use of government assistance. I see all the time landlords who would otherwise qualify, I think it's supposed to be, I see all the time individuals who would qualify, but they're told by landlords that because they get Section 8 or rapid rehousing assistance, they cannot rent. Is this a form of discrimination?
It would make me highly suspect. And if I was a housing group, I would at least call the state to ask them to make an inquiry, and this is why. There is a presumption that this would disproportionately impact a particular class that's covered, maybe based upon national origin, color, or race. And I'm not sure, because we don't have the resources to investigate it, but I would call the state and ask, can we look into this to see if a housing provider is discriminating? Just so everyone will know, the government now has made it so much easier for a person who is receiving government assistance to get their money direct deposited, or they work with housing providers so that they'll know what the standards are that a private housing provider is seeking, to the point where it's kind of hard to say I don't want to accept any government assistance because that money is almost guaranteed money anymore. So it would make me a little suspicious if I was trying to service persons, like let's say in a domestic violence situation, and I need to get them moved quickly, and Larry, the housing provider, is just saying, no, I don't want to hear. You know, can I ask you why, sir? And you got to know the programs that you work with. And for example, I do know that you can get automatic deposits. The check never goes through the tenant's hand into your bank account now. So we need to learn how to better spot discrimination that has a desperate impact.
I think that's all we've got in the chat box so far, but if anyone else has any other questions, or if you want to ask them now or shoot them into the chat box, we're happy to help answer those.
While we're doing that, if you would just flow with me for just a moment, I just want to remind everyone the rules for equal access for all these persons we were talking about. My concern is we see more intimidation to persons on national origin, or they're alleging national origin, because we have housing providers who want to up the rent, and if a person who is, let's say, Hispanic or Spanish speaking, they threaten to call immigration on them or their visitors and so forth, to try to get people not to enforce their rights under the law. That's intimidation. Another area we're kind of seeing on the increase is communities who have never served a particular race or national origin, doing things to continue that. And that would make me a little more suspicious because communities don't stay one way. You know, they may have been all one race for the last 110 years, but somebody comes through and they need emergency sheltering for 90 days or whatever your program calls for, and we make people jump through extra hoops. You may be having a problem and not recognizing it's a problem. So, you know, my concern is this: we need to work together to provide housing to all persons. So rather than go back and say this is what you haven't been doing, let's try to get you up to snuff so that from here on out you're in compliance with the law. Okay, Kelly, I'm all done.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us this morning for this webinar. Again, we have been recording this, so we will make that available and work with Merilyn to share the slides and the follow-up information that she talked about. If you've got any additional questions, please feel free to follow up with us, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for your time this morning.
Thank you. Bye-bye.